Hi, my name is Bob Hill. I'm the president of the Church of Scientology Mission of Riverdale at 308 Broadview Avenue in Toronto. Today's Sunday's sermon is number 56, and today we're going to go over the topic of how you can take control of the environment. You, the spiritual person, you. Now, in order to understand this, we have to understand that you have 8 major thrusts in your life, and I'm going to go over them quickly before I get into the main body of the sermon. These 8 things are called dynamics, and they start at 1 and go out to 8, and as they go out, you get a larger and larger and larger space. They're called the 8 dynamics, as I mentioned. A dynamic is an urge or a thrust or a flow of energy in a direction, generally for survival. Now, the first dynamic is the dynamic that deals with self. That's you and nothing else. Your immediate possessions, your body, your thoughts, your ideas. That's the first dynamic. As you move out and you decide you want to take on a little more, you arrive at the second dynamic. Now, the thing to understand about these dynamics, even though you may not be feeling part of them, they're there and they exist, and you do have them. The second dynamic is the dynamic that deals with the family, children, the sexual act itself, basically you with another person creating for the future. That's your second dynamic. Now, your third dynamic is the survival that you have the urge towards groups and seeing that group survive. That group could be your job, it could be your baseball team, could be your hockey team, whatever group it is. But there is an urge to survive as part of groups or as a group member. There's also an urge to survive as mankind. If you take all those groups and put them together, you have the fourth dynamic. So you have a thrust, an urge to survive as mankind, which is all of the groups together. We're all part of it, and it does exist. And it can take on various forms and cultures. However, it is your fourth dynamic. The next dynamic is the fifth dynamic. Now, this would comprise all life forms, down to the smallest cell to the largest whale in the ocean. All life forms are comprised of the fifth dynamic, plant and animal. So when you think of that, you think you have an urge or a thrust to survive in that direction. A lot of people own dogs or cats, or they grow flowers, or they have a nice yard. These are all their grass, their flowers, their pets. These are all parts of it. This is all their fifth dynamic. They have an urge to survive with that. Now, the sixth dynamic would be the physical universe dynamic. So you have matter, energy, space, and time. You have quite a bit of that, actually. If you take a look around you, there's a lot of matter, energy, space, and time. There's a lot of objects, your cars, your houses. The planet itself is made up of dust, and there are many, many more out there in the universe. So it's quite a vast dynamic. So you can see as you expand out on these dynamics and you reach out into them, you're getting more and more and more space. Now, your seventh dynamic is the urge towards survival as a spiritual dynamic. So all spirits, anything spiritual would fall under the seventh dynamic. And you can take a look at that as, well, there's probably quite a few spirits around if you consider that man is a spiritual being. And in some cultures, such as the Aboriginal cultures, they would tend to feel their spirit in just about everything. And you may even have that reality yourself. And then we come to the eighth dynamic, which is the Supreme Being, God, Infinity, Creator, some call it. And that is a personal belief, but consider a dynamic that deals with infinity. How far does infinity go? Well, there's no real end to it. So that would give you the vastness of that dynamic. So one has these 8 urges in life. And if one can get them all under control and aligned, he'll survive better. Now, today's sermon is going to give you a concept of how you can control these things. It comes from the book, The Fundamentals of Thought, and it's chapter 13 in that book. And the chapter is called Self-Determinism and Pan-Determinism. Now, before you get too, like, what the heck is Pan-Determinism? Well, Pan-Determinism simply means determining the action of self and others. It means wider determinism than self. Okay, so you got that? We're going to go into it in detail. So we'll start with self-determinism. Self-determinism is a condition of determining the actions of self. It is a first dynamic action. You know how we talked about that? So you have a first dynamic, self, just you. Well, what about those other 7 dynamics, you say? Well, if you're operating only on self-determinism, you're only operating from what you need immediately or what your body needs, and you don't care about the other dynamics. You'll just go about getting that action. So it is a first dynamic action and leaves the remaining 7 undetermined, or in actuality, in opposition to the self. Isn't that interesting? So it's actually in opposition. So if one walks around, which you see that going on in the world around us, as we shrink and we become smaller in our way of thinking, we pull back from those 8 urges in life, and we only become interested in self. And if we do that, then if we do things, they could be in conflict with the other 7 dynamics, and you could have an actual opposition occurring on your own dynamics. Thus, if one wants to take on the rest of life in a free-for-all fight, one could be entirely insistent upon total self-determinism. So you get that? So if you want to be in a fight all your life, then just be self-determined. Oh, I got to do this because I want to do it and I don't care what you want. You'll be in a constant fight, a battle. And if that's not necessarily a good way to live, because you're going to build up an edge and you're going to build up a lot of force coming back on you. And you may not be the happiest guy in the world. Maybe you'll make billions of dollars, but you certainly won't be happy. Now, as the remainder of the dynamics must have a say in oneself to function, they fight at once any attempt at total self-determinism. So the other dynamics actually fight against it because you're actually opposing the other 7 dynamics, not survival. I can tell you from personal experience that many years ago, let's say, I was only interested in the survival of self. And I couldn't quite understand why, there was all these arguments and things happening that weren't necessarily survival for me. Well, I had gone away from the other 7 dynamics, so they were actually fighting up against me. And it wasn't until a considerable amount of study in Scientology, to be frank with you, and personal counseling, that I was able to come to a point where I was willing to face those other dynamics. and bring them as part of my existence. Now, pandeterminism means determining the action of self and others. It means wider determination than self. Now, you got to really get that into perspective, because if you're just going to operate on self-determinism, you have to realize you're making yourself smaller. You're pulling things in towards you. If you're reaching out on those 8 dynamics, you have more survival going outward, and you have less survival as you come inward. So, in an aberrated fashion, we see this in an effort to control all others, to aggrandize, which that means to make more important yourself. You'll see that. Somebody who's majorly self-determinism, they'll try and control others just so they can make themselves seem important. Now, pandeterminism is a cross-determinism, or determinism of 2 sides. So it's taking both sides. You're making your decisions based on both sides instead of just that one. If one controls both sides of a chess game, one is above the game. One is determined then in any situation in which he is fighting. So if you find yourself fighting in a situation, for example, I hate my job, I don't want to get up, I don't want to do this, you're fighting against something, realize that you're just trying to be totally self-determined, and you're not going out across those dynamics and trying to change things. He is pan-determined in any situation which he is controlling. So you say, wow, how do I control everything that in my life? Well, what if you just try and make life a little more livable for those around you? Maybe put a smile on their face. Maybe try and make them feel a bit happier about themselves or about what they're doing. You're putting control on the environment when you do that. It doesn't have to be some big thing like you got to go out and become the vice president, or you got to go out and become the prime minister of Canada or something like that. You just have to put a little bit of control in on those other dynamics. To become pan-determined rather than only self-determined, it is necessary to view both sides. View is the key word there. Because as soon as you start to view things, immediately you're reaching out. If you're totally self-determined, you're not really viewing things. All you're thinking about is yourself. But when you become pan-determined, you start to view things. The shades come off, you're looking outward, you feel larger, you got more space. So, I'll give that to you again. To become pan-determined rather than only self-determined, it is necessary to view both sides. A problem is an intention versus intention. It is then something that has 2 opposing sides. So there you go. 2 opposing sides, you have a problem. By creating problems, one tends to view both sides in opposition. So if you deal with a problem, let's say you have a problem where you can't seem to find enough money to pay your rent. So you have your landlord wants to get paid, you don't have the money to pay him. So you have to view the problem. Well, how am I going to handle this? And you think, well, I could get a part-time job. So now you took a view of both sides, so you became pan-determined, and you came up with a solution that would solve that problem. Thus, a problem only appears to be necessary to man. So it only appears to be necessary if he's fighting the dynamics. The problem is the closest reality man has to pan-determinism. Funny, eh? Because it makes him look at things. In order to solve the problem, he has to step back and look. In processing, the invention of problems then shows a wider view, and so exteriorizes one from difficulty. So when you take on the subject of problems and you have the guy causatively doing it, he tends to get bigger and bigger, and he exteriorizes and he starts to see all of his dynamics. Isn't that something? Try that tool. You'll find that if you try and look at both sides in an opposition, you'll immediately start to progress outward on your 8 dynamics, and you'll get more